The room felt untouched by time. A thin sheet of dust floated in the air, suspended like old breath waiting to settle. The investigator, Marcus Hale, paused at the threshold the way one pauses before entering a memory. The wooden floor showed faint patterns where furniture once stood, and a pale rectangle on the wall marked the absence of a framed photograph removed decades earlier. His footsteps creaked softly, each one sounding like a reminder of something he should have caught long ago. The silence pressed inward, heavy, patient. It smelled of paper left in a drawer too long. The file had been reopened only weeks earlier, after a quiet review of unresolved records. No noise, no announcement, no ceremony. Just a clerk handing Hale a slim folder with a muted look, as if the past might hear them. Inside the folder lay a single photograph clipped to a report. The image showed a young woman, Elena Marin, aged 27 in 1978, with a calm expression and a tilt of the head that suggested curiosity about the world rather than caution. Her name had resurfaced because someone, somewhere, had finally cross-referenced a detail that once seemed too small to matter. Hale set the folder on the same table detectives had once used. The table still carried shallow marks, rings from cups, faint scratches from pens, the faint trace of past hands moving across it. He ran a finger near one mark but didn't touch it directly. The air held a slight dryness, like old pine warmed once by sunlight and now left to settle into its own quiet. Elena Marin had lived alone at the time. A small house at the edge of Brenton County, where the land opened into wide fields. She worked part-time at the public library and took night classes in environmental studies. Simple lines in a report, but the way Hale read them made each detail feel heavier than ink. He walked through the house carefully. The living room still carried the faint smell of dust mixed with something lighter, almost sweet, like an old fabric folded for years. He imagined her leaning over library books, adjusting them with gentle precision, perhaps humming or thinking through something quiet. He didn't need to see the original furniture arrangement to feel her presence. Certain rooms hold their history no matter how empty they become. On the mantel, a small piece of tape remained stuck where an evidence tag had been once attached. Evidence from 1978. Evidence collected, processed, stored, then boxed away as the years moved on. The case never faded from the files. It simply sank beneath others. Hale opened the front window slightly. Cold Colorado air entered the room, carrying with it the faintest sound of distant wind against winter branches. He let the air settle, then closed the window again with practiced calm. The photo of Elena lay face down now on the table. He placed both hands on the edge and breathed quietly. He had promised himself years earlier that he would not allow old cases to feel personal. The promise never held, not fully. Discovery 1, the photo. The clipped photograph was more than memory. It contained a detail that none of the original investigators had focused on, a small pendant around her neck, shaped like a narrow prism. Hale studied the magnified copy now stored on his tablet. The pendant wasn't recorded in any recovered items. It wasn't noted among missing belongings. A simple oversight maybe, or maybe something else. A former library colleague had mentioned the pendant in a brief statement. She always wore it, even on quiet days. The statement at the time had been regarded as casual background, nothing more. But the pendant did not appear in the evidence lists. That gap, small, clean, almost invisible, was the detail that brought Hale back into this room. He stood still, replaying the interviews from those years, voices captured on grainy tape, hums, crackles, pauses, statements given by people who were younger then, now older or gone. The pendant might have been lost, or taken, or simply overlooked. He opened the original interview log. The first entry from a library coworker named Ruth Ainsley contained a line that had not been re-examined. She said someone asked about her pendant once, didn't know why. That was the first thread. Discovery 2, the file. The file holding Elena's last library workday was surprisingly thin. A few sign-in sheets, a list of returned books, and a single overdue notice she had issued near closing time. One name stood out, Daniel Creighton, a regular reader interested in land maps and county development plans. Creighton had been questioned briefly in 1978. Concise responses, cooperative, no hints of concern in his record. He had left the county the following year, moved to a neighboring state and built a quiet professional life. No incidents, no patterns, just a name that reappeared when the pendant detail surfaced. Hale flipped through transcripts again. Creighton's original statement contained a momentary pause when asked about the last time he saw Elena. Not suspicious, just faint. One of those pauses that linger only because everything else feels too smooth. I think she mentioned something about old county maps, Creighton had said back then. Not precise, not verifiable, just enough to register. Maps, development plans, land use records. Hale focused on that, the pendant, the maps, the last day. Each fragment small, too small to anchor conclusions on its own. But together they formed a loose shape that settled into place the longer he examined them. Investigators return. Hale stepped back into the hallway of the house. The boards responded with soft sighs. A faint draft moved along the corridor, shifting a piece of paper left behind during earlier redocumentation. The paper scraped softly as it slid. He crouched, picked it up, examined it. It was blank, likely a page used beneath an evidence sheet decades ago. He held it a moment longer than necessary, sensing the weight of the case more than the weight of the page. The scent of aged wood filled his senses. It reminded him of storage rooms at the department, rooms where unsolved files waited in stacked boxes. Those spaces always carried a subtle echo of time, as though each file wished to speak if someone would just open it again. Elena's case was one of the oldest on his desk. He had requested it not out of sudden curiosity, but out of a quiet ache to understand the spaces between facts. He moved toward the small study at the back of the house. The room still held a single built-in shelf where books once stood. One bracket showed a faint, darker outline, like something had been pressed against it for years. He touched the outline lightly. The wood felt uneven. He took a slow breath. That outline had not been mentioned in the original search notes. Discovery 3, the statement. In the archive, Hale had revisited a statement from a neighbor, Alora Tate, who had described seeing a vehicle near the house on the final evening Elena was last seen. The record noted her uncertainty. Maybe brown, maybe gray, hard to say. But Hale had listened again to the tape. At one point she said something else, almost under her breath. Thought it might be someone from the land office. That line wasn't included in the typed summary. Not intentionally omitted, likely just overlooked amid the clutter of notes and dead lines. Land office. Maps. Creighton. The connections were faint, not alarming, not sharp. Quiet lines. Lines that lived in the background until light hit them from the right angle. Investigators' internal quiet. Hale sat on the floor, back against the wall. The room felt colder now. He allowed himself a moment to remain still, to listen to the hum of the present sliding across the quiet of the past. He thought of Elena's last library shift, her arranging maps, straightening books, adjusting the pendant around her neck out of habit. He thought of her walking home, the sky dimming into late evening, the distant outline of county land rising like a quiet horizon. A case is not only evidence. It is the record of small details repeated until someone listens closely enough to see their shape. Hale exhaled slowly. He reopened the folder. A faint impression on one page caught his eye, two small words written lightly in pencil, nearly erased. He angled the paper toward the window until the indentations revealed themselves. Map room. No signature, no date, just handwriting pressed faintly into the fibers. Methodical reconstruction. Hale placed the photograph, the transcripts, and the map details in front of him. He aligned them in a row, letting the arrangement guide his thought process. A pendant. A map room. A repeated interest in county land records. A visitor who paused slightly when questioned. A neighbor who mentioned the land office without intention. A built-in shelf with an unexplained outline. None of it was dramatic. None of it pointed to a sudden revelation. But each element, placed with care, built the beginnings of a path. He leaned forward as if listening to the room. The faint hum of the heater filled the silence. Paper shifted softly as the air moved. The logic forming in his mind was calm, not rushed. An investigator cannot chase the past with speed, only with patience. He returned to the pendant. Why had no one looked for it? Why had it not appeared anywhere in the collected items? He pulled out the item list from 1978, read it twice, then again. One entry caught his eye: metal object, small, unlisted description transferred. No follow-up description existed. No attached image. No catalog number linking it to the pendant. It could have been anything, but the phrasing, unlisted description, was unusual. It suggested the collector wasn't sure what it was at the time. Hale made a brief note: object unidentified, recheck transfer logs. Logic tightens. The twist forming wasn't cinematic. It wasn't loud. It emerged slowly from the structure of simple facts. If the pendant had been mistaken for a generic object, if the person most interested in her pendant had been studying land maps, if that same person had been in the library on the final day, if the neighbor had connected the vehicle to the land office, if the map room note matched Creighton's research habits. The logic didn't conclude anything yet, but it led quietly toward something steady, like footsteps approaching in another room. Hale closed his notebook softly. He looked once more at Elena's picture. Her face carried no fear, no tension, just calm curiosity, a look belonging to someone who believed the world made sense. Cases like this rarely granted resolution with warmth. Justice, when it arrived, felt procedural, almost cold. But the human part, the part that kept investigators in empty rooms decades later, came from the quiet desire to honor the truth, not just solve it. The wind nudged against the window. Hale stood. There was more to follow. The evening outside had shifted by the time Hale left the house. A muted blue-gray sky hung over the field, the kind of winter light that stays low even at midday. The wind pressed against dry grass in soft, uneven waves. He paused near the fence line, letting the air settle around him, grounding his thoughts. Cold cases require patience, he reminded himself, not just with evidence but with memory itself. Time reshapes everything: rooms, statements, recollections, even the smallest impressions on a page. At the station, Hale spread the materials across a long table used for archival reviews. Each document lay in a precise row, forming a tableau of quiet fragments. He didn't force connections. He allowed them to sit in front of him, forming their own silent gravity. He returned first to the transfer logs, the place where all collected items eventually ended up. The entries from late 1978 were handwritten, the ink nearly faded now. As he traced the columns, he found a record labeled Object C47, metallic, non-categorized, transferred without description. Next to it was a scribbled note, "Reevaluate category if linked." It had never been linked. Hale leaned back in his chair. The pendant could easily have been miscategorized. Small personal items often were in late 70s field collections, especially in rural counties with limited resources. Still, he needed more certainty, something more solid than a historical clerical oversight. His attention shifted to the old interview tapes. Fragments of old voices. Tape 3C carried the conversation with the neighbor, Elora Tate. As the reel played, her voice filled the small review room, gentle, slightly unsure. Behind her words, Hale could hear faint environmental sounds. Wind, maybe a distant car, perhaps the tape hiss of age. Thought maybe from the land office. The line reappeared, soft, almost accidental. On the original transcript, it had been flagged as uncertain, likely dismissed because Tate herself seemed unsure. But when Hale listened closely, when he paid attention to cadence instead of content, the phrase didn't sound speculative. It sounded remembered. He paused the tape and replayed the few seconds again. Then again. There was a rhythm to her voice, one of recognition rather than assumption. Hale made a note, qualify statement through secondary witness review. He needed to find someone else from that era who might confirm whether land office visitors routinely used similar vehicles. Patterns can be as important as direct evidence. Opening the map records. The county's land office kept meticulous archives, rolled maps stored in cylindrical sleeves, stacked neatly by year. Hale visited the office early the next morning. The clerk, a man with gray hair and a steady voice, guided him to the 1978 section. The map smelled faintly of old paper, a dryness mixed with ink. Hale unrolled several on a clean table. They crackled softly, edges curling upward like they hadn't been touched in years. One particular map caught his attention, a zoning draft from the spring of 1978. A small annotation in the corner held initials, DC. Creighton had reviewed maps heavily that year, but the annotation wasn't proof of anything. It simply placed him within the sphere of county development interest. Still, Hale's instinct told him to keep the detail in view. He continued scanning the maps until a thin folder slipped midway out of a shelf, as if nudged by its own weight. Inside were visitor logs from public inquiry hours. Most entries were simple signatures. Toward the bottom, though, one date stood out. The same week Elena disappeared. Visitors recorded. 1M Haskin, 2R Blythe, 3D Creighton. Hale felt the room grow a little more still. He kept his breathing steady. Logical steps, he reminded himself. One detail at a time, no rush. He photographed the log and returned it carefully to its place. Reconstructing her last week. Back at the station, Hale plotted out a clean timeline. He placed the events on a long strip of paper, each date spaced evenly. The timeline became a silent framework anchoring his thoughts. Tuesday, Elena teaches a library workshop on environmental records. Wednesday, she checks out 2 land use books. Thursday, she receives a question about her pendant from an unidentified visitor. Friday, she closes the library, seen walking home. Following morning, her absence noted. The pendant had meaning, though its significance remained submerged beneath layers of silence. He revisited the workshop notes. On the margin of one page in neat handwriting, someone had written, "Ask about older maps." The handwriting was not Elena's. It matched none of the librarian staff signatures from the era. It was an anonymous note left on a workshop handout. Hale circled it on his copy. Another quiet detail. Minimal dialogue from the past. He loaded tape 5A, Creighton's 1978 interview. The sound quality was uneven, but the tone of the conversation remained intact. You visited the library often. Pause. Yes. Last visit. Longer pause. Thursday, I think. Purpose. Cough, shift in chair. Research. The tape clicked faintly in its reel, a mechanical heartbeat beneath the words. Hale closed his eyes, letting the sound settle. Fragmented, hesitant dialogue always carries weight, not because it implies wrongdoing but because it reveals internal calculation. People pause when they search memory, or when they manage it. He rewound the portion where Creighton mentions research. The stress landed awkwardly on the first syllable, a linguistic quiver, subtle but present. Another note in Hale's book, Speech Pattern Review, minor tension. Compare with later interviews. He needed Creighton's present-day voice to compare. Decades can alter tone but rarely change innate rhythm. Return to the shelf outline. The outline on the built-in shelf in Elena's house stayed in Hale's mind. A rectangular shape, slightly darker, faintly indented. Whatever had rested there had been long enough to leave an impression, but narrow enough not to cover the full shelf width. He contacted preservation staff to revisit the physical space with more sensitive lighting. Under raking light, the outline revealed minute trails, thin compression marks, most likely from a box or a tightly bound stack of materials. A document box. A set of rolled maps. A storage container. The size aligned more closely with a map case than a book. He made a third note, object on shelf likely related to maps. Cross-check with land office sample sizes. The shelf lived in the back room. A room often used for sorting documents, a room where a map case would naturally fit. And if a map case had been there in 1978, who borrowed it? Who returned it? Who removed it before the search team arrived? The silence around that question felt heavier than the question itself. The pendant's logic. Hale looked again at the magnified image of Elena's pendant. The prism shape had 6 clean edges, forming a narrow hexagonal column. It caught light in the original photo with a subtle reflective sheen. It looked handcrafted. He visited the library archives to determine whether the pendant had symbolic connection to her environmental work. Some students in the late 70s wore small prism pendants carved from quartz, used as personal keepsakes or tokens. But this pendant seemed different, longer, narrower, with a faint linear groove along one side. A map key. A stylized coordinate marker. A piece of an older drafting tool. Small, yes, but meaningful. He made a copy of the photo and outlined the pendant shape 3 times, searching for any symbolic pattern. Nothing obvious appeared. Still, items often hold meaning to those who study land, surveyors, cartographers, environmental researchers. The link remained thin but unbroken. The interview that was never conducted. Hale found mention of a man named Lionel Artris in the early search notes. Artris had been a volunteer at the library during the time Elena worked there, helping with book cataloging. He had moved away the same year and was never interviewed, not out of avoidance, but because his departure predated the formal search. Locating him now was difficult, given the decades that had passed. But Hale filed a request to run a background trace. A lead is a lead, even if faint. In cold case work, The smallest names often carry the largest answers. What logic revealed next? He returned again to the timeline. This time he focused not on Elena's movements but on Creighton. Records showed he visited the land office that week. He borrowed maps from the library earlier that month. He was the only library patron who attended all of Elena's workshops that year. He lived 3 miles from her house at the time. His vehicle type matched the general description from the neighbor. None of this proved anything, but Hale knew the pattern of proximity. When multiple threads align quietly, they often point to direction, not certainty, but direction is enough to move forward. He brought up a modern contact record for Creighton. He now lived in a suburban area 2 states away, retired from a career in geographic planning. His professional life aligned exactly with the interests Elena pursued. He hosted community discussions on land preservation. He published essays on environmental mapping. He had built a life around the same field that had connected him to Elena. A quiet parallel that stayed unseen until Hale connected the archived pieces. The logic continued forming its slow shape. A visit to the library basement. Hale returned to the library itself, a building modernized with new floors but preserving its original structure beneath layers of paint. He requested access to the basement archives, where older records and unused materials were stored. The basement was cool and dry, with a smell of paper sealed in boxes for decades. Catalog drawers lined the walls. Near the far corner, he found a section labeled Maps and Land Records, 1960–1980. Box 17 caught his eye because of a faint scribble on its edge, Marin. The question mark made the marking ambiguous. Perhaps someone had meant to verify whether the box belonged to Elena's donated materials. Inside were 3 old map tubes, a pair of gloves used for handling materials, and a set of blank note cards. But under the note cards, he found a flattened envelope containing 2 photocopies of zoning drafts. Both were dated the week before Elena disappeared. Both had margin notes written in a hand that matched the anonymous workshop note. Cross-check boundaries. He stared at the handwriting, thin strokes, slight right tilt, a faint loop at the base of the letter D. He compared it to the margin notes from the workshop. Identical. Someone had left both. He wrote in his notebook. Anonymous writer was present during both events. Possible overlap with land office visitor list. The envelope contained no name, no direct identifier. But the handwriting matched one other source, one that Hale hadn't yet revisited. He pulled up Creighton's old visitor logs. His signature slanted slightly forward, with similar thin strokes. Not identical, but close enough to warrant expert comparison. The room felt colder. Quiet realization begins to form. Hale didn't jump to conclusions. He moved slowly, feeling his way along the edges of the logic forming around him. Creighton had an interest in maps. He attended the workshop. He had been at the land office the same week. His signature carried similarities to the anonymous margin notes. The pendant might have held land significance. The shelf outline matched the size of a map case. A metallic object had been transferred without description. Each detail remained ordinary on its own. Together, they formed a quiet, steady direction, one that pointed not to chance but to intention. Hale closed the basement box, returned it to the shelf, and stepped back. The hum of the fluorescent light filled the silence. Dust floated gently when he moved. The room felt like it was waiting. He exhaled, slow and measured. The logic was becoming clearer. But clarity is not closure. Closure demands confrontation. He was ready. Morning light thinned across the parking lot when Hale stepped out of the station, coat collar raised against the wind. The air carried a quiet sharpness, the kind that made each breath feel clear and unfiltered. He stood still for a moment, letting the cold steady him. His next steps required precision, not momentum. He reviewed his notepad one more time before driving out. Patterns had finally aligned, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the understated certainty that emerges after years of silence. His task now was to speak to Creighton, not as an accusation, not as confrontation, just inquiry. Inquiry with unmistakable direction. The drive out of state took most of the day. The passing scenery, stretches of open land, scattered winter trees, faded barns, felt like echoes of the 1978 terrain he had spent so long studying. Landscapes hold their own continuity, even when people move on. Creighton lived in a modest suburban neighborhood, a quiet street with trimmed hedges and low fences. A wind chime hung from the porch, barely moving. Hale approached the door and knocked once, with the calm firmness of someone who carried both certainty and restraint. The door opened slowly. A man in his early 70s stood there, steady posture, calm eyes, an expression shaped by years of routine. "Mr. Creighton," Hale said softly. A pause. "Yes. I'm reviewing archival records. I'd appreciate a few minutes if you're willing." Creighton's gaze flickered, almost imperceptibly, toward the folder in Hale's hand. Then he stepped aside and gestured him in with a small nod. The living room was tidy, muted in color, lined with bookshelves containing land survey materials, history volumes, and several older maps under glass frames. The space smelled faintly of paper and the light hint of varnish from the wooden furniture. They sat across from each other, a coffee table between them. Hale placed the folder down but didn't open it yet. He waited for the silence to settle naturally into the room. "You studied land records for many years," Hale began, his voice low, clinical in tone. "Since the 70s. "Yes," Creighton replied quietly. "You visited the county office in 78. Another pause. "I did." Hale opened the folder just enough to reveal the photocopies from the library basement, the zoning drafts with handwritten margin notes. "These were found recently," he said. "The handwriting is similar to yours." Creighton inhaled slowly, eyes lowering toward the papers before returning to Hale's face. A long silence followed. It wasn't a defensive silence, nor a panicked one. It was reflective, measured, almost rehearsed by years of internal review. Hale let it hold. Investigative pauses often disclose more than spoken answers. Creighton finally spoke, voice steady. "I was studying map boundaries. That part is true. Boundaries connected to the project Elena was researching." Another stillness filled the air. "Yes," Creighton said. His admission wasn't startling. It felt like a detail settling exactly where logic had prepared a place for it. Hale didn't press. Instead, he asked, "You attended her workshop?" "I did." "You left margin notes?" "Yes." "You saw her on the last day she worked at the library?" A very faint shift, barely visible, passed across his expression. "I was there late," Creighton said, "reviewing land use drafts." "And you asked about her pendant?" This time Creighton's eyes moved, a small flick toward the window as if searching memory. "It looked familiar," he said. "Not the piece itself, the shape. Old survey markers sometimes used a prism style. I asked about it, briefly." "Why wasn't that included clearly in your original interview?" "I don't recall," he said softly. "Maybe I didn't think it mattered." Hale studied him quietly, not with suspicion, but with the deliberate stillness of someone who weighed every word. "Mr. Creighton," he said, "a map case was likely removed from Elena's home before investigators arrived. A narrow one, leaving a specific outline. You were one of the few people who worked regularly with such cases." Creighton's hands clasped lightly together, fingers tightening for an instant before relaxing again. "I didn't take anything," he said, calm but faintly strained. "I never entered her home." The denial wasn't forceful. It was soft, as though spoken from a practiced place rather than a reactive one. Hale did not accuse him of anything further. Instead, he placed the last document on the table, the transfer log listing Object C-47, the unidentified metallic item collected in 1978. "We believe this may have been her pendant," Hale said. "Mislisted at the time. It was found closer to the back room than originally reported." Creighton exhaled again, slower this time. His shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat but in recognition of inevitability. "I remember that pendant," he murmured. "It reflected light in a certain way." Hale nodded. His tone remained level clinical. "Your proximity to her work, your interest in the same maps, your presence that week, the handwriting, the visitor logs, they create a consistent pattern." "A pattern," Creighton repeated quietly, not defensive, just acknowledging. "This isn't accusation," Hale said calmly. "This is alignment of facts, facts that lead us forward." Creighton stared at the photocopies again. His expression shifted into something subdued, almost resigned. "I thought about that week many times," he said. "Not because I feared anything, because I reviewed every moment, trying to remember if I overlooked something or someone." Hale absorbed that, logical, measured, unemotional, the kind of reflection that comes from someone who carried silent questions for decades, not panic, not guilt, just the unsteady weight of an unresolved proximity to a moment in time. He asked, "Did you see anything unusual the last evening she worked?" Creighton hesitated, a genuine hesitation. "A vehicle," he said, "parked near the trail across from the library. I didn't recognize it. I didn't think it mattered then." "What color?" "Dark," he said, "maybe gray, hard to say in that light." Hale wrote the phrase silently. The neighbor's old statement echoed faintly in the back of his mind. Creighton added, "I walked home shortly after. I didn't follow her. I didn't speak with her." The words were steady, specific, neither overly detailed nor evasive. Hale closed the folder. "Thank you for your time." Creighton nodded once slowly. As Hale rose to leave, Creighton's voice stopped him, quiet, almost an afterthought. "She was a thoughtful person," he said, "focused. She cared about the importance of maps, not just lines and boundaries, meaning." Hale turned slightly, watching him for a moment. The truth of those words didn't feel rehearsed. He stepped outside. The wind chime on the porch moved once, a single soft note carrying into the cold air. The logic after the conversation. Back on the road, Hale let the conversation settle. Creighton's responses contained no confession, no dramatic reveal. Yet the alignment of facts remained firm. His connection to the pendant, the map notes, the library presence, the land office visit, none of it vanished. But none of it turned into a singular, closing certainty either. And cold cases do not resolve themselves through dramatic certainty. They resolve through steady accumulation until the weight of evidence pushes the scale to one side. When Hale returned to Colorado, the department's analysts reviewed the handwriting samples. The conclusion: High probability of match between Creighton's margin notes and the anonymous map annotations. Not definitive. Not absolute. But strong. The metallic object, catalogued decades earlier, was re-examined. Under modern lighting, faint etching appeared along one edge, linear, intentional, consistent with pendant designs used in old surveying communities. It was almost certainly Elena's. Further review of land office logs identified a second visitor whose signature resembled the neighbor's vague description of the vehicle, and who had ties to zoning disputes at the time. That individual, now living out of state, was brought in for questioning. Their timeline conflicted with earlier statements. Inconsistencies surfaced, enough to form a probable cause framework. And 2 months later, after layers of cross-referencing, interviews, environmental mapping analysis, and procedural review, an arrest was made. Not Creighton, the man who had used similar land records that week. The man whose vehicle aligned with the neighbor's second recollection. The man whose connection to Elena had once been considered too faint to matter. Everything hinged on a small, logical trail, a pendant, a shelf outline, a mismarked object, and the quiet details Hale refused to overlook. After the arrest, Hale stood alone in the archive room late one evening, reviewing the completed case report. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. The paper smelled faintly of toner and old files. Outside the windows, late winter wind moved through the trees in soft circles. The resolution felt procedural, calm, almost cold, not triumphant. Justice in old cases rarely brought warmth. It brought order, closure shaped through process, evidence aligned, names recorded, statements cataloged, a system restoring its own balance. He closed the report and rested his hand on the cover. Elena Marin's photo lay underneath the files, half hidden. He pulled it out and set it upright on the table. Her calm expression watched the room with the quiet patience of someone who had waited far too long for clarity. Hale stood there, breathing slowly, letting the silence settle around the old image. He thought about the pendant, the small prism shape, the way it reflected light. He thought about the shelf outline, the timeline, the map notes, the faint pencil mark, map room pressed into old paper. He thought about all the details that seemed insignificant for decades, until the right angle of attention revealed their quiet weight. And he thought about what justice means in a case where decades had already passed, how it often feels more like an administrative correction than a human resolution. He closed the lights, leaving the room dim. Just before stepping out, he looked once more at Elena's photograph. Somewhere between justice and silence, something human remained, unresolved but present, like a faint outline on a wooden shelf that never fully fades. He let the door close gently behind him,